Hello everybody, it's Claire back with another art journal video, and surprise surprise, I'm playing in the craft journal, but it's the large one. And I'm starting off using some syrup paint, and I'm going to be using it to stick this collage tissue paper into my journal. The syrup paint is a really lovely colour, especially when used on the craft. It's very in keeping with the colour of the craft background, and this is a great way to get collage tissue paper onto your page, because as the paint dries it will stick. So this is some collage paper from one of Dina's packs. I think it's the text collage pack. I'm not entirely sure. She's got so many, and they're all so brilliant. I love them all. So as I've said about this journal, particularly this one, more so than the little one, the paper is very thirsty, and it does absorb quite a lot of the paint. So you will end up needing to use more paint than you think you do to start off with. The only way to kind of combat that is to use some clear gesso on the page first. And I suggest clear gesso because it will still allow the colour of the craft paper to come through. Okay, so once that was dry, I then used some buff paint from Dina Wakeley and this Circles for Painting stencil, and popped some circles onto my background. And again, I'm doing that technique where using the blending tool, you can kind of smoosh it around, you get a little light layer of paint, and then if you dab it, it will go on in a darker way, in a heavier way, I guess, more opaque, and you can create kind of shadowing with your stenciling then too. It kind of gives a bit more of a textured feel to your stenciling as well, especially when you're using a shape like this, which has got quite large filled in areas. So then this is a stencil I want. It's one of Dina's older ones, and this is Penny that I'm using with this. So I kind of just wanted this writing to be in the background mostly, knowing that using the metallic paint, it gives it a little bit of a shine. So as the light catches it, it'll show up in different places. I love how it works against the syrup paint as well. It just works really well. And then I decided I wanted it to be a bit more opaque, so I'm going back in and just going over it again. And then I had a little bit of paint left on my glass mat, so I decided I would just make a bit of a wash to go over the top of that, to try and just push that syrup paint back a little bit because it was a little bit heavy. So this stencil is called Scribbled Faces, and using a blending tool, I'm adding some paint through the stencil onto my page. So a little tip, which I'm sure a lot of you already know, is when you're using a stencil that's got fine details, particularly like this one, don't have too much paint on your blending tool because it will bleed through the details on the stencil, and you won't get a particularly crisp image, unless of course you're not really worried about that, then it doesn't matter. I think the stencil moved there, didn't it? But I'm not really worried. It's okay. Okay, so then I'm just extending some of the lines, and of course it is dry, so I'm going over it using my Posca pen, just pulling those lines out a little bit more. I didn't feel they were dark enough, and then I'm just extending them at the top and the bottom, so they kind of touch the top and the bottom of the page, and it means that the image then isn't floating in the middle of the page and just feeling a bit disconnected. So then once I've finished this bit, I'm then going to be using my craft knife and cutting mat, and I'm just going to cut out the edge of this page just to make it have a little bit more of an interesting feel. So I'm basically following the outline of the stencil, and I'm just going to cut this extra part away. So the little mat that I'm using underneath is a Dilutions one. It's the perfect shape for slotting into these journals. It's just right. It's not too chunky, not too big, and you can more easily move it around to get it in the right angle. Okay, nice and easy. And then I'm going to use this text collage paper that says blah, blah, blah. I'm going to make some little speech bubbles coming out of the mouth. Now, with hindsight, I wish that I'd backed this onto some white paper first, just to make it a little bit more opaque, because when it gets stuck down, obviously, if I'd thought this through, I would have realised this at the time. It's going to go a little bit translucent, and of course, it's not as easy to see. But it's okay, it still works, but I think if I'd put it onto white paper first, it would have made it stand out a little bit more when it was stuck down. So here we go, you'll see what I mean. Like, what a wally, not thinking about that. But it's okay, it still works because it's still there, and I think I do end up sort of outlining it a little bit, so that does kind of pull it out a little. But it wasn't quite as obvious to see as I wanted it to be. You see what I mean here? So if it had been on white paper, then it would have stood out a little better. And apparently now I have a Calippo to eat, so I'm sorry about that in the video. Just like absent-mindedly eating it without even thinking that I was filming what I was doing. So one of my children went to the shop. This was a really hot day in the UK, and we were just like, oh, we could just have a nice lolly, that would be lovely. So this is a really good advert for Calippo, isn't it? I promise I'm not sponsored by them at all. So that was just some mark making there using some Posca pens. Trying to keep the shades quite neutral. So it's not really often that I use neutral colours in my journaling. Often I'm bright colours or pinks and purples. Those are my go-tos, and turquoise, that's one of my favourites as well. So to do a page that's a little bit more neutral tones, it's quite a nice thing to do for a change, but not usually my go-to. So doing lots and lots of different coloured Posca pen dots, but obviously, like I say, just in neutral tones, and then adding the black and white for the contrast as well. I've also used the white pen and just outlined some of the lines for the faces and put a little catch light in the eyes, and then I'm just adding some writing down that left hand side. And you notice there that the pen is disappearing into the journal where there isn't any paint. So all you need to do is just layer over it a few times. So I'm giving it a dry and then going back in and going over it again, just to help it get to a point where it's saturated enough that it will stand out. And then I'm just using a thinner Posca pen, and I am outlining all of the letter here. And that just helps to kind of pull it out a little bit from the background, and just makes it a little bit more obvious. You notice I've also outlined those speech bubbles in white. That also draws a bit more attention to them too, because I was just like, oh my gosh, they've disappeared completely. But it worked in the end. Usually there is a way to fix things if things don't go quite how you want them to. And also, I try to think, like, it doesn't really matter. Sometimes I get a bit annoyed if things don't quite work. But, you know, the reason that I'm doing this journaling in the first place is a lot of the times it is for kind of therapy, I suppose. And because I absolutely love it. And so sometimes just the actual process of doing the art is enough in itself. So there we go, there's my finished page using some quite neutral colours for a change. So I hope you've enjoyed watching this page with a little bit of a cut out edge, nothing too difficult. So thanks for watching, and I hope to see you again soon.